It's a delight to be with you here this afternoon, and I'm going to talk about 4 themes that interest me in the area of language education, and 2 of them are really education generally. They're not just language. But I want to begin with something represented only by a news article that you may have seen in last Saturday's New York Times with the headline, Hopi Artifacts. Protested sale of Hopi work brings $1.2 million. You may have seen that story, or you may not have, but a brief précis so you'll know what's going on. There was a set of ritual objects and masks, which are a part of Hopi traditions. The Hopi are a Native American nation in the middle of Arizona. They have for centuries lived in that part of the world. Indeed, one of their villages, Old Aribe, is said to be the oldest human settlement in North America, at least that can be attested. And historically, they have practiced agriculture, dry farming, dependent completely on rains, and they have evolved a very elaborate ceremonial calendar marked by ritual observances, certain social dances that are held in the open plaza, and private dances, religious dances that are held in a kiva, a ceremonial chamber that's part of their settlements, which are physically and visually very dramatic, adobe villages perched on 3 very high mesas in the central part of Arizona. Now, you may wonder, what's the connection between the sale of Hopi artifacts and anything to do with language and language education? There are a variety of connections, and I want to talk about what a few of them are this afternoon with you. If you followed that story, you saw pictures of various katsina masks, masks based on sometimes animals, sometimes objects like watermelons that are painted true to life but have a place for eyes, because part of the Hopi ritual calendar is to celebrate the way of life that makes a person Hopi. It's very central to identity observance, and every person in a Hopi village has his or her role that's really quite clear and ingrained from childhood, whether this is learning to be someone who could become a katsina. This would be a young man and then a man who would actually carry out the dances, or a young woman and later a mother, grandmother, member of the community who would, and this may not be surprising to you, serve the important function. It's not only ritualistic, but it's certainly common, of making food for the members of the village and those who participate, and also passing on many of the other important traditions, observing things like naming ceremonies for babies. In Hopi, a person can have up to 3 different names: a baby name conferred at birth, an initiation name given at the point of initiation, entry to young adulthood, and a name for the outside by which people are known. Now, why should we care about this? What does this have to do with language and education? And for me, it is, for reasons that I will develop here, the questions that arise around both language learning and cultural fidelity and identity have a great deal to do with the kind of experiences that an individual has. Now, many of you here, I recognize, are concerned with the kind of instruction that takes place in classrooms. And that's certainly important. It remains important to many of us. But we sometimes forget, we who are so focused on classrooms, that much of what has to do with the kind of person we become predates our classroom experience. And after all, even if we are students in very intense and intensive programs, we might spend 6 to a maximum of 8 hours in formal classroom settings. I know that some of you come from traditions where there are much longer school days, places where you might supplement the instruction received in school with instruction and practice received through tutoring sessions, sometimes even cram schools, so that a school day in some parts of the world lasts up to 10 hours. And there are reasons for that, but compared to what it takes to truly become a Hopi, and Navajos would say to truly become a Navajo, where your job is to move appropriately through these stages of life with constant appropriate attention to one's relationship with others and the environment, with an attitude of humility and service, and with awareness that there are different observances, and you as an individual and as a part of the collective have an important role in maintaining these observances. That's a kind of intense and extended experience that is very, very different from the formal instruction that most of us think about. Why should we be aware of this? Well, something that a event like the sale of Hopi artifacts bring to the fore is there are conceptions of education, culture, and language learning that are very different from what we have learned to think about in formal school environments. And the differences as well as the similarities require much careful thought as we consider different agendas for language learning and teaching on the part of individuals, communities, and also on the part of researchers who would like to understand any of these phenomena better. If you read that story, you know that part of the controversy was that a cache of Hopi artifacts from the 1930s and 40s, already in Europe, in private hands, was going to be sold, and sold to the highest bidder. And sort of a side note, you may or may not know that in Hopi tradition, some things are so sacred that outsiders should not lay eyes on them. Well, the New York Times, providing all the news that's fit to print, and this can include visuals these days, displayed full-color pictures of many of these, even from the first story about that. And I would say that my local paper in Flagstaff, Arizona, printed only the Associated Press story with a note that because Hopis find it offensive for outsiders to look on ritual objects without appropriate preparation, they had refrained from printing the pictures. But back to why it's important, the idea that some, in this case objects, in other cases practices, are so important, so sacred, so meant to be handled with reverence, that they should never enter into any kind of commercial transaction, is one that actually we need to think seriously about in all kinds of education, not merely language and cultural education. And I will return to that at the end of the talk. But let me now turn to the first paragraph of what I have mentioned in the handout you have about the reasons that connections between language and culture being extraordinarily dynamic as well as complex in the current environment. I would say almost everybody here is aware of all the research on mixed language codes, the very interesting and dynamic way that different languages can combine and recombine in communicative settings, not only interpersonally in interactions that might have been labeled as casual, sometimes intimate, related to the family, but also, depending on the language and the setting, public settings. So the kinds of linguistic realities reflected in code switching and code mixing, studied for a very long time by many people in the world of applied linguistics and also formal linguistics, is very much with us today. There remains interest in whether and how such combinations of language have a place in formalized instructional settings. The more we know about communities where two or more languages are used, the more we know that students and often teachers believe and use two languages together in various ways, frequently to achieve very important and subtle communicative ends. So I have cited for you there Peter Sayre's interesting work on the way a veteran teacher in San Antonio uses a combination of languages to help her second graders move ahead, to understand new concepts, to allow them to connect with the history of their neighborhood and their own families in this area in a way that she understands is possible. Recounting to them lived experience in those neighborhoods that predate their own existence. And this, of course, is something that not every second grader might necessarily stand for, but her students, with whom she has clearly developed a long and respectful relationship, understand that when she talks, it is their job to pay attention, respect what she has to say, and use it for their own creative and intellectual ends. Now, some of the work on mixed codes, of course, comes from the wonderful classic research done even within a few blocks here of Teachers College. Ana Celia Zentella's work on El Bloque, where, of course, the demographics have shifted quite dramatically since she did that work. But that beautiful portrait of the way young children learn to use two languages and alternative approaches to literacy in each language, even over their first 5, 6, 7, 8 years of life, is one that could be documented in a number of other communities, not only here in New York, but in communities around the world, where there's a sense of bilingualism as a constant presence in the lives of speakers and in communities where, not merely at home, but in the bodegas, sometimes the clínicas, other community settings, sometimes workplaces, two languages are a regular companion to the reality of what goes on. And that, of course, connects to the idea that languages can be developed together. The balance can shift over the life course. It does shift over the life course. And languages can sometimes be lost. Much research talks about the issues related to language loss when young children find their language is not valued in school, even if it may have a place in the curriculum. But then, of course, languages can also be revitalized. The individual aspect of being bilingual in different circumstances is beautifully summarized in François Grosjean's second edition of Being Bilingual, there on your handout. And I think in the examples he describes, there are eloquent testimonies to what it means to different people to have grown up with a language, sometimes to have lost it, sometimes to have revived it successfully, and sometimes not to have needed to make the language they once knew a part of their current experience. Now, of course, there are many places, not only in this country, but elsewhere in Europe and throughout parts of Asia, where people don't necessarily come to settle, they move back and forth. The experience of many New Yorkers going between New York and Puerto Rico has reflected that for decades, but that's not the only community in which people arrive and return. They may establish settlements. They might work for years, even decades, and then return to countries that they had once left. Marcia Farr's wonderful work with the ranchero community, living in Chicago, but going back and forth pretty regularly between the settlements they have, and as she puts it, Chicagoacan, and their own rancheros throughout Michoacan, reaching maybe into the northern province north of that as well, are very fine examples of people who are good at seeing opportunity, taking advantage of it, and learning enough English to be as successful as they need to be, depending on the jobs they fulfill in Chicago. Now, let me turn to the situation of Indigenous languages, at which I would hardly say that I qualify for any kind of expertise, but I would say that when we consider the case of Indigenous languages in this country or elsewhere, we have so many important questions that we sometimes don't ask with respect to some of the other languages that have had a place in formal education for centuries. So, for example, if people go back and forth between Puerto Rico and the U.S., the odds are that they would be able to find educational programs in each language, sometimes both languages together, because those exist. The same is certainly true of people who go back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico, although that's been a lot harder to do since some of the border crackdowns. Many people still manage to do it successfully. And there are, of course, educational programs in Mexico in Spanish, and to some degree still, thank goodness, in the United States, though sometimes bilingual programs have had to be both creative and strategic in deciding to be labeled sometimes as dual language programs, sometimes as Spanish immersion programs, in order to continue doing what the participating teachers and often communities would wish to have offered, and that is education through two languages to some degree, so that children and older learners have a path to not only bilingualism but biliteracy. But think for a minute of the interesting questions that go with languages where literacy is late imposed. And this, to some degree, is the case with Hopi and the case with Navajo, where people know very well, many of them, that they are Hopi, but where learning in Hopi has, until recently, not had a place in school curriculum. And yet the need to know the language, to speak it, to understand it, to relate to your clan relatives, to participate in the ceremonies that mark you as a member of the community, is shown through your comprehension, your attitudes of respect, and your ability to do what you need to do to show you're a member of the community. Such interesting questions arise, and Sheila Nicholas, herself Hopi, has written, I think, some wonderful articles and a dissertation on the situation of young people who know they're Hopi, are perfectly proud of being Hopi, but don't speak the language. And one of them even instantiated in the quote that begins the article, "I live Hopi, I just don't speak it." And the person who produced that quotation is something else that you may not be aware of, the person who at that time was the reigning Miss Indian America. So now think of what it means. Mainstream speakers might look at something like a Miss America contest, and of course Miss X contests abounded in many parts of the states, and little girls might have been socialized to have their own contests in many neighborhoods. I know I lived in such a neighborhood. Though I was usually behind the scenes rather than a contestant. But I can verify that indeed Miss Indian Nation contests, Miss Navajo contests still occur, and my university even has a Miss Indian NAU. Perhaps a holdover, amazingly, from the days when it was relatively unusual for a number of Native Americans to attend university, and it was thought to be appropriate to recognize their presence by having a contest like this. And now around that contest there is a celebratory event, typically a powwow, which, as many of you I'm sure know, it's a day-long celebration, sometimes 2 days. So what's extraordinarily interesting about this situation is that in Hopi and on Navajo, there is strong interest in maintaining traditions, but what that means differs. And in Hopi, it differs by the village that you're a part of. And this is something that we talked about a bit earlier today, for those of you there. But many times, as outsiders to communities where other languages are used, we speak of the community of Puerto Rican speakers in New York, or Mexican Americans in Chicago, or even a Hopi community, which is much smaller, in northeastern Arizona, or a Navajo community, as if the community had a single feeling and spoke with one voice about relationships with language and culture. In fact, all of those communities are as diverse as our mainstream communities, with different individuals and families taking different perspectives for very good reason. But with many native languages, as I recognize many of you probably realize, there's not merely a history of what I might say would be ignorance and sometimes criticism based on using another language. There is an active, still a very long historical memory of the history of repression, where children were taken from homes, forbidden from using the native language except in dormitories sometimes, and even then sometimes discouraged. So we have a very complicated social psychological matrix that leads to lingering feelings of distrust and unease in a way that's not found so much in other language communities where there's a tradition of literate instruction in Spanish, let us say, or for example, Chinese or Korean in the country from which people come, because of course in other places it can be a mainstream language. And this may correspond, some of you are familiar with the term, to subordinated minority groups as compared with voluntary immigrants. This goes back to John Ogbu's work, and it has a number of linguistic and cultural implications which we need to tease apart, and which members of these communities have found different ways to address and resolve. And their own personal identity solutions, we might say, can be different from one another for very legitimate reasons. And that's something that's really quite difficult to reconcile with things like standardized educational programs. Think now of the case of the Hopi artifacts. How do people in Hopi feel about that? Well, they are likely to have very different feelings, but some of those feelings could have to do with, of course, resentment, disgust that Europeans thought sometimes to be more cultured, that North Americans would go ahead and engage in a transaction to buy and sell objects that to very traditional Hopis relate to the ceremony which celebrates the renewal of their lives, that is, the home dance ceremonies held in the monsoons when rain returns to the very high desert of northeastern Arizona. So there are many, many questions that pertain notably, though not only, I think, some of them, to indigenous language groups whose history with education, formal education in the Western sense, is relatively recent, and whose own practice of language is very strongly based in oral tradition. And for many, many decades, I think, the idea that oral tradition had to be a precursor that would be superseded by development of literacy, and that literacy would improve the state of a language, was, I think, a tenet that had very close to widespread, if not universal, acceptance in the world of language and literacy teaching. And some of you may have heard the term reduced to literacy, as if that were a positive achievement in language. Well, think of that, reduced to literacy. There's a writing system developed. Well, is that a good thing? I think different communities might have different perspectives on that, and in fact, sharing experiences. Some of you have mentioned working in communities where there is great interest in reviving traditions of practice that might include things like storytelling. But I would say, too, for Hopi and for some traditional groups, the place of a young child is not necessarily to speak. So speaking rights, now this of course flies in the face of much Western child raising, where we think, yes, lots of language early, the more children speak, the better it is. Lots of language, and they should not only hear language, they should talk to everybody, and about anything. And children are granted sometimes pride of place. Sometimes, parents, not only mothers, but sometimes will step in and represent the voice of the child, telling daddy what they did today or something. Well, this is not the way in many traditional indigenous communities, where the job of children is to be children, to engage in age-appropriate activities that involve respectfully attending to adults sometimes, but who also have a great deal of autonomy in the activities that they themselves can select. Now, sometimes this is related to very traditional pursuits, being in the fields and being able to amuse yourself while an adult male in the clan engages in corn planting by hand. Think how laborious that is. Or being with your grandmother and being prepared and ready to both watch the sheep, who always need watching, or goats, because they're, wandering off and things can happen. But also understanding when you have license to play by yourself on your own, and having individual play or small group play with brothers and sisters, a clan relative, being an essential part of what it is to be raised as a respectful member of that community. Speaking comes in, but it can come in later. So rights to language are, I believe, handled differently in many but not all Indigenous communities than they might be handled in what we would consider mainstream families. And the idea that that now the question in many bilingual programs in Indigenous communities is, are there different ways that we should look at language? How should we try to develop not merely comprehension and mastery of linguistic forms, but the belief systems, the cultural loyalties that go with them, has a number of different solutions and might indeed be resolved in different ways at a very local level, in ways that it's sometimes hard for us to conceive of as outsiders. And sometimes, of course, this is done with the aid of elders. When I did some research, this is on Navajo some years ago, there was a program that would bring in those who were grandparents, and it was referred to as a foster grandparent program, but rather than being a foster grandparent for a family, classrooms would have a grandparent in them, often a grandma, who was a fully, fluent speaker of the language, but not a teacher, who could be present and talk with teachers and children about what she knew and remembered. And she was a valued part of the classroom bilingual environment, even for children who didn't necessarily speak Navajo yet, because the position of grandmother or grandfather is one of great respect, and the children knew that they had better pay attention, because if they didn't, somebody would get back to their own families. And that's a kind of social control that can't be exerted everywhere, but in some communities it makes sense to have. So one interesting question that makes the question of language and culture so dynamic is that the relationships between what is done in school and what is lived outside the classroom can be very different depending on the community. The degree to which a classroom would be expected to include literacy and all the skills that go with it, development of literacy, and the expectation that we often say very blithely, yes, we want to develop fully biliterate, bilingual children. What really would biliteracy mean? A very important goal, and you probably know one of the classically important bilingual schools, Rough Rock School, still delivers a bilingual curriculum all the way through 12th grade, having students do discovery projects and report them in the class newspaper in English and in Navajo. And that was attained with many years of struggle. And they are justifiably proud of the fact that regardless of shifting winds in federal policy and sometimes even funding, they have found a way to continue that development. And I say hats off to them. Their solution works for them. It may not be one that every Indigenous community would aspire to as they seek to answer the question of what does it take to raise children appropriately in the 21st century and support their development so that they become valued members of the community as they move through the life stages. So different combinations of language and culture pose one challenge. Another is inevitably, and I really feel a bit funny talking about this in an environment that's really relatively close to medieval. I mean, here we have stained glass, we have arches, we have carpets, we have the representatives of Judeo-Christian culture behind me looking on, I'm sure with approval. Maybe there's, I hope with approval. But no better place to speak to the choir maybe than in a chapel. But we can't forget that for the experience of many students and teachers now, we have to ask the question of, are we using electronic literacies? If so, what are we doing with them? And there are so many interesting kinds of communication going on outside of classrooms. Should they have a place inside? Do they have a place inside? Do we know what that means? We were talking earlier in the colloquium about ways that some both traditional and imaginative online programs and materials make it possible for students to expand the peers with whom they can communicate in a second language or a first. And many students really enjoy that. They're deeply engaged by what they can do with different forms of electronic communication, and that's wonderful. And I also, when I worked on Navajo, found that students, it was a kind of a perfect example of the right material for the right age level. That you may know there's a community college on Navajo, Tsaili Community College, though I don't know what the enrollment is now, it was thought that this was one way to help students who had attended local schools on the reservation be able to make a transition to a university still in a supportive cultural environment, so that after 2 years they could consider moving into other environments of higher education. And they had developed, this was now more than 15 years ago, so you know the state of electronic communication was quite different. What you may not know is that what's very important in many Indigenous communities is understanding one's clan relationships with a very high degree of detail. Not just so you know who you are, but now we're talking about young adults, right, going into community college, so you can understand who you can date. Because if people are too close to you in clan relationship, it is not appropriate for you to consider them as romantic partners. It's not exactly the incest prohibition, but it's understanding that you have different relationships to different members of the community, and it's a very different way of understanding one's place in the world. So, more than a decade ago, a linguist, a very fine linguist, Clay Slate, who was not Navajo but spent many years in Navajo, developed a program such that students could put in their own clans and get information on which clans they had such close affinity relationships with that it would be inappropriate to develop a romantic attachment to, and which clans were outside that boundary. And for young adults, we're talking 18, 19, 20, if you're going to observe a traditional way of life, you might just want to know about that. Though, of course, there is intermarriage now with many Indigenous groups, and this takes place, of course, Navajo and Hopi, not just between those two groups, but with members of outside communities. It's interesting to see that that's cultural information. It wasn't explicitly linguistic, but it was also something that was valued enough in the community that many young people wanted to find that out. Now, I'll say maybe more now about ethnographic work, more recent than that, has shown how much visual information is a part of our world now. And Shirley Heath's truly magisterial work in her most recent book documents in fuller detail than I ever could the number of oftentimes now the grandchildren of some of her initial informants in Ways with Words, and how the children grow up in a world that's full of images, that being able to both capture images, manipulate them, and transmit them is a crucial way that they communicate with each other and work out the information of interest to them, such that visual information frequently accompanies any verbal information that they supply to each other, and this is very much a part of their out-of-school lives. And sometimes it makes it into their classroom projects. And these are families of mainstream students throughout the East Coast, Midwest, and the large cities to which her original informants moved. So this is something that reflects the experience, I would think, of most people here, who've seen young people deeply interested in the number of devices that allow them to depict and share the visual realities of their lives and even design it. This is related also to the great enjoyment that many young people feel participating in many visuals, including video games. And people like Stephen Thorne and others have given us insights into the way gamers can establish particular kinds of, I believe, what the Vygotskians call intersubjectivity, so that they learn to see the world and value different kinds of moves. But I would say for everyone, understanding different forms of electronic communication and what those mean to the users raises at least questions for language education and education. How can images, or should images, be combined with words? If so, how? What makes it interesting? And what would be appropriate, or back to the case of some things they are too important and too sacred to appear in visual images. That can vary a great deal by communities. Now, a wonderful article which is on there that that helped me understand more about different kinds of communications that include music. Betsy Rhymes' terrific 2011 review of the various repertoires of digital schooling. And she talks about, in a beautiful, a kind of extended pun, asking both young people and adults to develop pardon me, what she calls repertoires of deference, not difference, so often discussed, but repertoires of deference, young people towards what adults want them to learn, adults towards the literacies that young people value, to be able to enjoy the potential of electronic communication in different combinations. Excuse me. I would say, along with Rhymes' article, I am interested to see the research by Sherry Turkle, who studied not so much educational applications, but the questions of what do electronic communication patterns mean for interpersonal communication. And I think this is clearly a frontier, and we honestly don't know a lot yet. We're still finding it out, but even she mentions the question of sharing information through actual languages, not merely text messages. And I'm sure some of you know, if you have very young children, that it interests me that outside the field of language education, even pediatricians' offices now display guidelines for screen time for children as young as under 2 years old. It's really quite interesting to see the way both adult unease and ignorance, and I certainly count myself among the ignorant. I'm not always uneasy, perhaps, because of ignorance, and questions about what are the forms of communication and verbal behavior that we want to encourage, how are those supported, and why, if we've been comfortable with various kinds of informal exposure before school, which was, of course, the norm in many communities and remains the norm in very traditional communities, that the job of a child is to be respectful, to listen, sometimes to participate, but not always. What is it about us that makes us uneasy with simply another way to represent the world, as some of us, I think, sometimes are? Very interesting questions about what digital communication means for language, and also, I think, for literacy in the traditional sense, for reading and writing. I mean, it is true that, of course, some children and young people are so deeply engaged by new literacies. Of course, the kind of standard conventional view is, oh, yes, now we can use this as a bridge, typically how it's presented, to traditional literacy. And whether we're talking about a bridge, even the bridge series from African American English into more standard English, or the metaphorical bridge, if students really like using fill in your favorite device, iPad, etc., for these games, then maybe they'll really get good at them, and this will help them not only succeed in school, but typically excel at the demands we expect the school of the future to have. Well, of course, maybe that's true, maybe we don't. We're all engaged in this together, figuring out what this will mean not only for adults and for children as we look ahead to education and language learning. So let me then talk about now two trends that are not so specifically linguistic, but have, at least the first, has some implications for language learning and teaching. And the third trend that we've talked about already to some degree this morning in the interview and then in the colloquium is the question of choices in education. Choice is often seen as a not merely desirable, but an unmitigated positive. And it may so be for many people, but what are we choosing? Activities in the classroom? Are we choosing whole forms of schooling? And what does school choice mean for individual learners, for families and communities? As a school of education, you know that policies that favor school choice, specifically policies that favor the ever greater charterization of public schools, have come in for some relatively strong criticism from some very thoughtful corners. The idea that developments in charter schooling further fragment a social reality, and that many charter schools have very little resemblance socio-demographically to the communities where they are sited. Now, this is really, we're part of an ongoing experiment in this, and very strong critics of charter schooling, people like Gene Glass, and I'm sure some of you have read both his book and some of his articles, recognize that he is a very vigorous critic of the opportunities that charter schools can provide for increasing segregation. And this may be something that we should think about, but at the same time, I want to recognize the fact that the movement towards choice in some districts and communities has been exploited in what I view as a potentially positive way, because it opens the door for different curricular innovations that can include schools that become magnet schools, not only for STEM, which is the overriding emphasis in most of the educational innovations now, because people have such enormous anxiety about low levels of science and math achievement, and they see those generally as more operationally tied to technical futures, which enjoy privileged place in many discourses of educational reform, but charter schools that take imaginative approaches to the development of bilingualism and or biliteracy. So whether those schools are called a language magnet, whether they're called dual immersion schools, whether they have other names, I think that some school districts have, with considerable persistence, worked out ways to provide, sometimes these are called immersion, using the label from the Canadian schools, sometimes to refer to a reality that's similar, sometimes different. They've tried to work out ways to use a curriculum that has a consistent guiding philosophy about the use of one or two languages along the way to promote high quality and linguistically rich experiences for learners in a way that's very laudable. That's one interesting trend. Charterization has also been used, as you may know, by certain communities to create what they view as safe and culturally appropriate environments for children and young people. Some of the most interesting examples, at least that appearing in the literature, have to do with schools that are established not explicitly for particular religious groups, but that reflect a guiding philosophy of, for example, Islam, favored by many Somali families in the Midwest, where they feel that charter schools reflecting their philosophy and their ways of practice can create environments for learning that are safer for their children than very large public schools. And the article by Robert Fox et al. On your handout gives some additional examples of charter schools that have tried to take thoughtfully a question that had been, I would say, pushed to the side in much American educational discourse for anyhow, maybe 50 to 60 years, at least the question of how should we approach issues of religious practice in schools? Is it possible to have a school that recognizes and respects a religion without proselytizing. And this is a very lively area, as you might know now, in many school districts, and it's an area also of legal challenge. That is, one can look at not only the question of what's alive in research, but also what's alive in litigation. And, and sometimes we should. After all, without litigation, what would our schools, what would have happened with the philosophy of separate but equal that was, at least for a while, nominally and actually to some degree suspended after Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. But questions can and should be raised. What are we looking at now with charter school realities? Are there new forms of separation? What is that doing to the districts, the communities of which those schools are a part? And I think those are really very serious questions that I think we are only learning to grapple with. So we need to pay attention with ongoing solution. Many would argue, and I would say, of course, in Arizona, many would argue, that charter schools are good per se, no questions asked, because they instantiate choice, and choice is good. Well, what kinds of choices? For whom? And what do they mean? All those important questions of how does choice work through language, curriculum, activities, understandings, those remain to be answered. Excuse me. Okay, lastly, maybe, and I think this will bring us to a point where I hope you have questions and comments about some of the themes we've been discussing. A theme that I would say is bigger than us all is the question of who benefits from education. We should always ask that question, and we should ask who makes it possible for others to benefit. Now, I have to say, it would be completely disingenuous of me to raise this here in Milbank Chapel in Zankel Hall without recognizing that the understanding of late 19th, early 20th century philanthropy has led to the establishment of many august and extraordinarily effective, in many ways, institutions of education. Here we are in one, and my life would have been very different if I had not had the chance to attend a university founded by two grieving but also very, very wealthy parents who decided to have a university to commemorate their very prematurely deceased son, Leland Stanford Jr. So I recognize that the traditions of philanthropy have taken many different forms and have led to the preeminence of many educational and cultural institutions. But I would say, too, and here I think about the work of now philosophers, not linguists, people like Michael Sandel, who ask the question appropriately, is there anything, if in our very privatized economy, is there anything that's not for sale? And his book, which is entertaining, can really, I think, draw us up short, not as only as educators, but as parents, as citizens, asking questions about, well, if there are naming rights for beaches and trails and public parks, what about, say, those curricula that might be developed by interest groups? He has a good example, which some of you may have seen, of the curriculum about energy, ostensibly, of course, developed because the environment is so important, but which in fact mentioned only the benefits of coal-powered electrical energy. And this is something that touches us all, whether in air quality or, where I live, the quality of vision, quite literally, in the Grand Canyon. One of the biggest plants is the Navajo Generating Station. And in the curriculum, which of course was not called the coal curriculum, although that's who funded it, there was much emphasis on how we all benefit from energy. And there's no question. I mean, without electrical lights, and some of you probably lived here through the after effects of Sandy, I mean, no electricity, we are all in a bad way. But what does it take to sustain the kind of consumption that we've become used to? And is there only one way to supply energy? And after some protests, the curriculum, which had actually not merely been funded by an industry association, but it was distributed through Scholastic, a trusted imprint in many educational environment, and was finally withdrawn. But that's maybe one of the more egregious examples. There are any number of places where institutions, frequently, because of course public expenditure on education is now neither in terms of total amount nor proportionally what it was 10 or 20 years ago. So who do we look to help us achieve the public purpose of creating good learning environments? We may have to look to the deep pockets in individual environments, and many deep pockets are those of not necessarily individually wealthy families, but corporations. So naming rights to all kinds of institutions like ballparks. Zankel has particularly interesting examples of what happened as ballparks become not the home of one team, though the team is still based there, but say the Bank One ballpark, the Chase Manhattan Park. But this is happening everywhere, where our observances of collective enjoyment, whether it's baseball or being a part of a cultural performance, they don't belong to the city or the county who organize them necessarily. They are always practiced in places that remind us of the largesse in some way of corporations. So what are we moving to? Are the experiences that we have collectively that are meant to lead us to enjoyment together, to build up our collective sense of who we are as young people, as adults, as citizens, do they always need a corporate sponsor? Well, I think we should ask those questions often, and I think we might come back to the Hopi, who have a strong traditional component. Some of the members of that community were, of course, deeply enough offended by the sale in Paris last week to stand up and protest. And even if, unlike the Hopi, we don't have ritual objects that we treat with reverence amounting to the way we would treat a spiritual being, because that's what masks enjoy in very traditional Hopi practice, we can still ask the question, well, to what extent is it appropriate to see educational environments, particularly our elementary schools, the gym at the high school that needs a new floor or new baskets, or even college athletic facilities that have their own and different types of connections to corporate sponsors, as places where we look first to industries to make those activities possible. Serious questions, and I close with the fact that it might be time for me to sort of revive and revisit an article that appeared long ago in a journal so short-lived and obscure you can't even find it, sometimes even through Eric. It was a small article I wrote published in 1985 about adult English language teaching articles, and I surveyed teaching materials from the 1920s and then the 70s and 80s, and that article, Materials for Teaching the English Language to Adults from Citizen to Consumer, could never be truer than it is now in 2013. But all of that together, I hope gives you some things to think about as we explore the many ways that language, linguistic skills, culture, and cultural identity can interact and inform each other, not only in educational settings, but outside. Thank you so much.